In the heart of a quiet town, a house stood abandoned for decades, until the day the Thompson family moved in. But little did they know, the house wasn't empty. It had been waiting for them. The sun was setting as the Thompson family made their way through the small town, the winding roads lined with old trees that whispered in the breeze. It had been a long day of travel, and the family was finally at their destination. A charming yet eerie Victorian house on the outskirts of town. John and Mary Thompson, along with their children, Ben and Lucy, had moved here for a fresh start. The fast-paced city life had taken its toll, and they hoped that a quiet suburban town would provide the peaceful life they'd been yearning for. As they pulled up to the driveway, the house stood before them, large and imposing. Its dark, weathered wood creaked under the weight of years, and the tall windows stared back like cold, empty eyes. The house was impressive in a way. Its high turrets and intricately carved railings spoke of a grandeur long forgotten, but there was something off about it. Something that made Lucy, the youngest, feel a shiver run down her spine. "Mom, it's huge," Lucy whispered, her wide eyes scanning the house as she stood at the front door with her parents. Ben, her older brother, didn't seem to share the same apprehension. He just rolled his eyes. "Don't be scared, Lucy. It's just an old house. People live in old houses all the time," Ben said, trying to reassure his younger sister, though even he felt a flicker of unease that he couldn't quite place. Their parents, Mary and John, were already unloading the car, trying to get everything inside before nightfall. It had taken months to find a house in this quiet town, and they were determined to make it work. Their excitement about the new chapter in their lives outweighed any reservations they may have had about the house. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the neighborhood began to quiet down. The few homes around them seemed distant, their windows dark, and no one was out on the streets. The Thompsons hadn't noticed it earlier, but now it seemed strange, the complete lack of activity. As Mary and John moved inside to begin unpacking, Lucy lingered outside, staring at the house. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the house was somehow watching her. It wasn't just the dark windows, or the way the house towered over them like some ominous monument to the past. It was the silence, the absence of sound in a town that, by all accounts, should have been alive with life. As the family moved their things in, Lucy's curiosity drew her to explore the yard. She walked around the overgrown garden, her fingers brushing against the dead, crumbling vines. The air was still, the scent of damp earth heavy in the air. But as she passed by the back of the house, something made her stop. There, tucked away in the shadows, was a small graveyard. Old, forgotten gravestones lined the edge of the property, half buried in the overgrown grass. She gasped. It was strange, unsettling, and though it was clearly old, it was well kept. Lucy wasn't sure why it made her feel uneasy, but the sight of it sent a wave of dread through her. She stepped back, her heart pounding. Just as she turned to walk away, she swore she saw a shadow move in the corner of her eye. She spun around, but the graveyard was empty, silent once more. That night, as the Thompsons settled into the house, the unsettling feeling continued to grow. Lucy lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was large, filled with rooms they hadn't yet explored, and each creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the old windows, seemed to deepen the sense of isolation. The air felt heavy, thick with a strange, oppressive energy that she couldn't explain. Her eyes darted nervously around the room. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to twist and shift unnaturally, but whenever she tried to focus on them, they disappeared, vanishing into the dim light. She heard faint noises coming from the hallway, a shuffle of footsteps, or maybe it was just the house settling, but Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She turned her head to the window, the moonlight spilling into the room, casting long, ominous shadows across the floor. She heard a soft whisper, so faint it was almost imperceptible. Her heart raced. The sound was so gentle, So sweet, almost as if someone was trying to get her attention. It was coming from the hallway. "Ben," Lucy whispered, her voice trembling. She pulled the covers tighter around her and sat up, trying to convince herself that it was nothing, a trick of the wind or an old house settling. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Suddenly, the whisper became clearer. "Lucy." It wasn't Ben's voice. It wasn't anyone she recognized. It was a soft, childlike voice, calling her name in a way that seemed far too familiar. Her body froze, her skin prickling as the room seemed to grow colder. She bolted out of bed and rushed to Ben's room. But when she reached the door, she found him fast asleep, unaware of her frantic movements. She turned back, staring into the dark hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. But when she turned back to look at her room, everything was still. No whispers, no shadows. Just silence. By morning, the strange occurrences were barely mentioned. The family went about their day, as though nothing had happened. The house was old, they reasoned. Old houses creaked. Old houses made noises. But Lucy couldn't forget the whispers. She knew something was wrong, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was hiding something. Something dark. By the second night, the whispers grew louder. But this time, they weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from the children's room. The second night in the house was when things began to shift. At first, the Thompsons tried to dismiss the oddities as the usual quirks of an old house. Creaking floors, the sound of pipes groaning, a chill in the air. But Lucy couldn't ignore it. That same oppressive energy she felt when they first arrived was still there, lingering like a shadow in the corners of the house. It was the kind of feeling that made your skin prickle, your pulse quicken, and your breath catch in your throat. Lucy lay in her bed, staring into the darkness. The room was still, yet every corner seemed to hold something out of sight. Her mind raced with thoughts of the previous night, the whispers, the strange figure she thought she saw in the hallway, and the feeling of being watched. But she told herself it was just her imagination. After all, she was just a kid in a new place, away from her friends and familiar surroundings. But as the night deepened, the house seemed to come alive. The air grew colder, a stark contrast to the warmth of the day, and the silence pressed down on her like a weight. Then, out of the stillness, came the whisper. Soft at first, like a breath on the back of her neck. "Lucy, ... double quotes, her heart skipped. She shot up in bed, her wide eyes scanning the room. The whisper was faint, so faint that it might have been a dream. She looked at the window, at the dark shadows stretching across the floor. The wind wasn't howling, so it wasn't the draft making those sounds. No, this was something else, something that she couldn't explain. Her first instinct was to reach for the light, to break the silence with its comforting glow. But as her fingers brushed the lamp's switch, the whisper came again. "Lucy ... clearer this time." Her breath hitched. It wasn't her imagination. The voice was coming from the hallway outside her room, not from inside the house. "Ben," she whispered, her voice shaky. She hesitated before calling out louder. "Ben, can you hear that?" There was no response. Ben, her older brother, was a heavy sleeper, and as far as she knew, he hadn't been disturbed. But the voice wasn't just in her head. It was real. It was calling her. With her heart hammering in her chest, Lucy climbed out of bed and tiptoed toward the door. As she pressed her ear against the doorframe, she heard it again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a giggle, a soft laugh, childlike, eerie, and unsettling. "Lucy, ... The hair on the back of her neck stood up. Something was in the hallway, but when she opened the door, there was nothing there. The house was as silent as it had been before. The dark hallway stretched out before her, empty, the shadows clinging to the walls. She glanced over her shoulder toward her bedroom. Nothing was out of place. No one was standing there. And yet, the feeling of eyes on her didn't disappear. She crept into the hallway, her breath shallow, trying not to make a sound. The whispers continued, faint at first, but gradually getting louder. They were coming from the children's room. Lucy froze. The room she had shared with Ben was still dark. She glanced over her shoulder, but the sounds from behind her didn't stop. Lucy. Swallowing her fear, Lucy moved towards the children's room, each step echoing in the silence. When she reached the door, she hesitated. Her heart was racing, and every fiber of her being screamed for her to turn back. But the whispers, no, the voices, were too clear now. They were coming from inside. Ben, she whispered urgently, pushing the door open. Ben, however, was fast asleep, his face calm and relaxed, oblivious to the disturbing sounds that had been tormenting Lucy all night. She sighed with relief, but then noticed something that made her freeze. The room, though still and silent now, looked different. The atmosphere felt heavier, charged. The faintest outline of a shadow stretched across the wall, though it couldn't have been anything real. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath. Just as she turned to leave, a soft sound made her stop. It wasn't a whisper or a giggle this time. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, almost like a child's fingers drumming on the floor. Lucy's heart raced, and she could feel the cold sweat starting to form on her palms. The tapping was getting louder, closer. It sounded like it was coming from right behind her, but when she turned around, there was nothing there. She spun back toward the bed, her mind racing. Something in the room felt wrong. The doll, it had been sitting on the bed earlier, the same doll that had appeared out of nowhere the night before. Now, it was lying on the floor, facing up toward her. But that wasn't the unsettling part. The unsettling part was the expression on its face. It was staring directly at her. The empty eyes of the doll seemed to bore into her, and she could have sworn it was grinning. She gasped and ran back to Ben's side, shaking him awake. But as she tried to rouse him, the tapping continued, no longer just from the floor, but from the walls now, as if 1,000 tiny feet were running through the house. Ben awoke groggily confused, but the noises were gone as quickly as they had. "Come, what's wrong, Lucy?" Ben muttered, wiping sleep from his eyes. "I was just dreaming, I heard it too," Lucy whispered, but she didn't feel like she could explain. The fear in her chest was too strong. How could she make him understand? How could she tell him that the house wasn't just an old building? It was alive, and it was calling them. The rest of the night passed in silence, but the unease lingered. The house felt different now, its silence deeper and more unsettling than before. The whispers had stopped, but they would be back. She knew it, and they would only grow louder. By the morning, the air in the house felt suffocating. Lucy wanted to tell her parents about what had happened, but she feared they wouldn't believe her. She had already overheard them discussing how this old house just plays tricks on the mind. But she knew the truth now. The house had secrets. Dark, terrible secrets. One fateful evening, Lucy ventured into the attic, where she found something that would change everything. She found them, but they weren't living children. They were ghosts. Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with the house. The whispering voices, the shadowy figures, the inexplicable noises, everything seemed to point towards something more sinister than just an old building settling. By the third day, she couldn't ignore it any longer. The house had a story, a dark history, that seemed to be waiting for her to uncover. After school, when her parents were busy sorting through boxes, and Ben was off with his friends, Lucy decided to investigate the one place they hadn't yet explored, the attic. The old, creaky staircase leading up to it had been sealed off with a heavy wooden door, and though they had tried to avoid it, something about the attic called to her. She felt as though the answers to the house's mysteries were hidden up there, just out of reach. Lucy grabbed a flashlight and slowly made her way up the stairs. Each step creaked under her weight, and the air seemed to grow colder the higher she climbed. When she reached the top, she pushed against the door, which groaned in protest as it opened. The attic was shrouded in darkness, but the beam of her flashlight cut through the shadows, revealing old furniture, broken lamps, and dusty trunks. The place had a musty smell, like something long forgotten. At first, Lucy didn't see anything unusual. The attic was filled with the detritus of the house's previous owners, forgotten heirlooms, old paintings, and boxes stacked haphazardly. But as she made her way deeper into the room, something caught her eye. In the far corner of the attic, there was an old, faded trunk. It was small, almost child-sized, and it had a strange, antique lock on it. Lucy's heart raced with curiosity. She approached the trunk slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the latch. With a soft click, the lock gave way, and she lifted the lid. Inside, she found a collection of old photographs. The first few were typical family photos, pictures of happy people standing in front of the house, smiling as if they had no care in the world. But as she sifted through the stack, she found something that made her blood run cold. There, among the photos of a mother, father, and children, were strange, blurry images. Pictures that didn't belong. The faces of the children were obscured, almost like someone had deliberately smudged them out. Their bodies appeared faded, as if they were disappearing in front of the camera. The mother's face was clear, but there was something about her expression that made Lucy shiver. An unsettling sadness, a hidden sorrow that she couldn't quite explain. The more Lucy looked at the photographs, the more she felt a strange connection to them, as if the people in the pictures were trying to tell her something. One photograph in particular stood out. It was of the two children, the same blurry figures, standing in front of a tree in the yard. The tree was twisted and dark, its branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. It was a place Lucy hadn't noticed before, but there it was, captured in the photograph. The children stood there, looking directly at the camera, their faces partially hidden by shadows, yet their eyes, those eyes, were staring right at her. Suddenly Lucy heard a sound, a soft, faint giggle. She froze, the flashlight trembling in her hands. The giggle was coming from somewhere behind her, echoing in the vast silence of the attic. She turned around quickly, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was nothing there, just the dimly lit room, the forgotten items piled high in corners. Her eyes darted around the attic. Was it just her imagination? She stood frozen, straining to hear any further sound, but everything was silent again. The only noise was her own breathing. But then, the whispering began. Soft at first, like the breeze in the trees, but growing louder, more distinct. Lucy, The air around her thickened, and she felt as though the walls were closing in. She stumbled backward, her hand brushing against a dusty old rocking chair. The chair creaked, moving slightly as if someone had just stood up. Her breath hitched, as she realized there was no one there. No one, except the ghostly presence that lingered in the attic. Lucy dropped the photographs and ran from the attic, slamming the door behind her. The whispering followed her, growing fainter as she descended the stairs, but the oppressive feeling in the house remained. She had to tell someone. She had to make sense of what was happening. That evening, after dinner, Lucy sat down with Ben. She told him everything she had found, the photographs, the giggles, the whispering voices in the attic. But Ben, though clearly disturbed by her account, didn't seem to believe her fully. He laughed nervously and said, "Come on, Luce. It's just an old house. Maybe the wind or something made those noises." But Lucy wasn't convinced. She knew what she had heard. She knew what she had seen. There was something in the house, something that wasn't alive, not in the way they were. And it wasn't just the house that was haunted. It was the spirits of the children who had once lived there. Over the next few days, Lucy continued to feel the presence of those unseen children. It wasn't just the attic that haunted her. It was the house itself. Every room seemed to hold a secret, every corner a shadow that watched her every move. At night, the whispers grew louder, and sometimes, in the dim light, she would catch a glimpse of those same blurry figures from the photographs. faint outlines standing in the hallway or lingering by the staircase. One night, she couldn't stand it any longer. She had to know the truth. She needed to know what had happened to the children in the photographs, the ones whose faces she couldn't make out. She needed to understand why the house was so determined to keep its secrets. Lucy ventured back into the attic, this time with a sense of purpose. She wouldn't leave until she found the answers. As she searched through the boxes once more, her flashlight landed on something new, another box. This one tucked behind the old wardrobe. It was smaller, more delicate, and when she opened it, she found a yellowed piece of paper. On it, written in elegant handwriting, were the words, "The children are waiting." Her breath caught in her throat. What did it mean? Why were they waiting? Suddenly, she heard it again. The soft giggle, the whispers. This time, they were louder, closer. Lucy looked around frantically, but there was nothing to see. No shadow, no figure, just the heavy silence that hung in the air. She felt a chill creep up her spine as the words from the paper seemed to echo in her mind. The children are waiting, but for what? For whom? And most importantly, what would happen when they finally found her? In the attic, Lucy found an old diary that told the heartbreaking story. The children hadn't just died, they had vanished, their bodies never found. The night after Lucy's chilling discovery in the attic, the weight of the house's secrets felt heavier than ever. The eerie giggles, the shadows that never seemed to belong, the whispers that grew louder with each passing night. All of it pointed to something terrible. Lucy couldn't get the photograph of the children out of her mind, their faded faces haunting her, their eyes pleading for something she couldn't yet understand. The diary. The thought of it kept creeping into her mind, and by morning, she couldn't ignore the pull any longer. She knew she had to find it. If the attic had held any answers, then this diary would have to hold the rest. She went back up there, determined this time. The silence of the house seemed to grow with her every step as she ascended the creaky stairs. The flashlight beam shook in her hands as she approached the spot where the trunk had been. But this time, she wasn't interested in the photographs. Her eyes scanned the attic, searching for something, anything, that might reveal more of what had happened here so many years ago. And then she found it. Tucked in a corner behind an old chest, there was a small leather-bound book. It was fragile, worn, and had a distinct musty smell as she carefully lifted it. The pages inside were yellowed, but the ink was still legible. It was a journal, a diary, to be precise, and the name on the cover sent a chill down Lucy's spine. Abigail Thompson. Her heart raced as she flipped the pages, reading the entries that had been written so long ago. The first few pages were filled with mundane details about life in the house, the children's schoolwork, the ordinary everyday occurrences of a family trying to build a life in a home that seemed to hold everything they needed. But then, as Lucy read further, the tone began to change. Abigail's handwriting became more erratic, the ink blotting in places as if written in a frenzy. The words jumped off the page, filled with despair and growing fear. Lucy's eyes widened as she read the first mention of the children's disappearance. April 12th, 1910. They're gone. I don't know how. I don't know when. They were here. And then they weren't. The house is silent now. The room's cold. I can't find them anywhere. I've looked everywhere, called their names, but there's nothing. The town won't help. They won't even talk about it. The next few pages described the frantic search, the mother's desperate attempts to locate her children. Abigail had scoured the house from top to bottom, but there was no trace of them. She had asked the neighbors, the townspeople, but no one seemed to know what had happened. The family was left alone with their grief, and as the months wore on, the whispers of the town grew louder. People started to say the children had run away, but Abigail knew that wasn't true. She had felt them close, in the house, as if they were still there, hiding in the shadows. But the truth came later in the journal, when Abigail wrote about something darker, something that no one would dare speak of aloud. May 3rd, 1910. I can feel them watching me. They're still in this house. Sometimes I hear them calling, but when I follow the sound, it always leads to nowhere. I swear, I saw their faces for a moment, just for a flash. But then they vanished. They never left this house. But they are not the children I knew. They are something else. Abigail's words became more fevered as she wrote. She spoke of dreams where she saw her children, but they were twisted, their faces no longer human. Their laughter, once innocent, was now hollow, full of malice. The shadows in the house grew longer, the air thicker, with something that had never been there before. Abigail began to write that the house itself had changed, as if it had become part of whatever had taken her children. Lucy turned another page, and what she read next made her blood run cold. Abigail had written about a night when she finally found her children, or at least what she believed to be them. June 8th, 1910, they were standing in the doorway, as they had so many times before, but they weren't the same. Their eyes, those eyes were empty, lifeless. They called my name, but their voices weren't right. I could see them, but they were not my children. Their bodies were here, but their souls were gone. I begged them to return to me, but the door shut in my face, and when I turned around, they were gone again, as though they had never been there at all. The final entries were the most chilling. Abigail had become convinced that her children had not simply vanished, they had been taken. The house had consumed them, their spirits trapped in the walls, forever wandering its empty halls. She spoke of the house's evil presence, something ancient and dark that was feeding on the souls of the children. Abigail was desperate. She knew she could never leave the house, but she could never be certain of whether her children were dead or still wandering the halls. July 14th, 1910. I feel them now, right behind me. I know they are here. They will never leave me. Not until the house gets what it wants. Not until it takes me. Lucy's hand shook as she closed the diary. The house had taken Abigail's children, and it had never let them go. The house was not just haunted, it was cursed. It was feeding on the spirits of the children, trapping them in its walls, never allowing them to leave. And now, it seemed, the Thompsons had become part of the house's dark legacy. The realization hit Lucy like a blow. Her family wasn't just in a haunted house. They were in a house that had been waiting for them. The whispers, the figures she saw in the corners of her vision, they weren't hallucinations. They were the lost souls of the children who had never left, the children whose lives had been stolen by the house itself. The truth was even darker than she had imagined. The children weren't just waiting, they were trapped, bound to the house by a force older than time itself. And Lucy was beginning to understand that there was no escape. The house wouldn't let them go. She heard a noise behind her, a soft shuffle, a footstep, and she spun around, but there was no one there, only the shadows, closing in around her. And then, the whispering began again, louder this time, more urgent. Lucy, Lucy, come play with us. It was the night of the full moon that the house finally came alive. The curse, long dormant, awoke, and the Thompsons were no longer just tenants. They were part of the house's dark legacy. The days blurred together after Lucy's discovery. The truth about the house's tragic history weighed heavily on her, and yet, the whispers never stopped. They were always there, just beneath the surface of the house's stillness. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, breathing in the same rhythm as the family, waiting for something, or someone, to trigger the curse that had been waiting for so long. As the full moon approached, the house seemed to change. The temperature dropped, and the once quiet house began to groan with life. At night, the creaking of floorboards grew louder, more pronounced, like footsteps pacing through the rooms. Lucy's dreams became filled with images of the children, those same blurry figures, now with more detail in their eyes, watching her, beckoning her. But when she tried to approach them, they always vanished, leaving her with the sense that she was never meant to reach them. One evening, as dusk settled over the house, Lucy found herself standing by the window, staring out at the darkening sky. The wind howled through the trees outside, but something in the air felt different, charged, almost electric. It was as if the house itself had come to life, preparing for something, waiting for the moment when it would awaken that night. As the full moon rose high in the sky, something shifted in the house. Lucy felt it first, an oppressive weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had never felt anything like it before. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the clock struck midnight, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The house seemed to hum with an energy that made the hairs on the back of Lucy's neck stand on end. She had been lying in bed, trying to ignore the sounds, but now she couldn't escape them. They were everywhere, coming from all directions, filling the air with a haunting melody of voices, the voices of the children. The house had been waiting for the right moment, and now that moment had arrived. The lights flickered, and Lucy's room grew colder. She pulled the covers tighter around herself, but it did nothing to ward off the icy chill that filled the room. The whispers intensified, swirling around her like a storm. She could hear her name being called, Lucy, but it wasn't a child's voice this time. It was deep, distorted, full of something dark and ancient. "Ben," she screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the overwhelming sound of the whispers. She ran to his room, but he wasn't there. The door was wide open, and the room was empty. Panic rose in her chest. Where was he? She turned toward the hallway, but what she saw made her stop in her tracks. The hallway was bathed in a pale, ghostly light. The shadows that had once been harmless now moved, shifting and stretching unnaturally along the walls. At the end of the hallway stood a figure, small and indistinct, but there was no mistaking who it was. The children, the blurry figures from the photographs, those same eyes, staring at her, watching her every move. But they weren't blurry anymore. She could see them clearly now, their faces pale and twisted, their features barely human. Their eyes were wide with fear, or was it hunger? They didn't speak, but their gaze was enough to freeze her in place. She wanted to run, but her feet wouldn't move. It was as if the house itself had paralyzed her, held her in its grip. The air felt thick, heavy, with an ancient presence, and the house seemed to close in around her. She could feel the walls pressing against her, suffocating her. "Lucy." The voice was louder now, clearer, coming from all around her. It was no longer a whisper, but a full, guttural command. And then, in an instant, the children vanished, leaving only darkness in their wake. Lucy staggered back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had to find Ben. She couldn't stay in this house another minute. But as she turned to run, the house stopped her. The walls groaned, and the floor beneath her feet shifted, as if the house itself was rejecting her. The house was alive. It wasn't just a place. It was a presence, a dark, ancient force that had been waiting for the Thompsons. The curse was real, and it had been waiting for them to arrive. Downstairs, John and Mary were oblivious to the terror unfolding upstairs. They had been trying to sleep through the night, but the house seemed to have other plans. The noise from upstairs, scratching, tapping, and faint giggles, had kept them on edge, but they tried to brush it off as the sounds of an old house settling. But now, they too began to feel the change. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. Mary sat up in bed, her skin tingling with an odd sensation. The whispers were growing louder now, filling the room like an oppressive fog. She couldn't tell where they were coming from, but they felt closer. It was as if the very walls of the house were speaking to her. She got out of bed, her feet cold against the wooden floor, and moved toward the window. The full moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. But as she looked out, something caught her eye. In the distance, near the edge of the garden, there was a figure standing motionless under the trees. She blinked, but when she looked again, it was gone. Mary's heart raced. Something was wrong with the house. Something she couldn't explain. She rushed to John, waking him from his restless sleep. "John, wake up," she said urgently. "Something's happening. I can feel it." But before John could respond, the house shook. It wasn't an earthquake or a storm, but the very foundation of the house seemed to shift. The windows rattled, and the walls trembled. A loud bang echoed through the house, coming from upstairs, followed by a scream, a piercing, desperate scream. Lucy's scream echoed through the halls, but no one could reach her. The house had claimed its prize, and now it was ready to finish what it had started so many years ago. The curse had awakened, and the Thompsons were no longer just strangers in an old house. They were part of its dark legacy. The whispers continued, calling them to stay, to become part of the house forever. And in the heart of the house, the children waited, their pale, empty eyes fixed on the new family that had arrived to join them. The children's ghosts were no longer silent. They were begging for help, crying out for someone to save them from the endless torment. The house had changed. The air, once thick with unease, now felt suffocating. The whispers had stopped, but the oppressive weight of the house's curse had only deepened. Lucy, Ben, John, and Mary could feel it, the strange, unshakable presence of the lost children. The house was no longer just a place of isolation. It had become a prison, a trap for the living and the dead alike. That night, Lucy could no longer sleep. She had tried to ignore the visions, the whispers, the terrible feelings that filled the house. But tonight, something had shifted. The children, those shadowy, blurry figures, weren't hiding in the corners anymore. They were here, present, real, and desperate. Lucy sat up in bed, the moonlight casting pale light across her room. The air felt colder than usual. She could hear the faintest rustling, like someone brushing past the walls, but no one was there. She could feel their presence, the children who had vanished, their spirits trapped by the house's curse. And tonight, they weren't just watching, they were reaching out. Suddenly, the whispering began again, but this time, it wasn't faint. It was loud, frantic. "Lucy, ... Lucy, help us, ... The voice wasn't distant anymore, it was right beside her. She could feel the cold breath on her ear, as though someone were whispering directly into it. Her body went rigid with fear, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the dark corner of the room where the voice was coming from. The shadows were shifting again. "Ben," she called, her voice shaky, but loud enough to rouse him. He didn't answer. The whisper came again, this time with more urgency. "Help us. Please, ... Lucy, ... The sound of the children's voices pierced through the silence, their cries full of pain, full of sorrow. They weren't just asking for help, they were begging. Lucy couldn't sit idly by anymore. She had to act. She needed to understand what they wanted, what the house wanted from her. Slowly, she stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, becoming more defined, more solid. Lucy's legs shook as she approached the darkened space. She was no longer sure if she was just imagining it, or if the house had truly come alive. But she had no choice. She needed to find out. As she reached the corner of the room, the temperature plummeted. The cold wrapped around her like a thick fog, and the air turned oppressive, stifling her every breath. She reached out her hand, trembling towards the shadowy corner, where she felt their presence most strongly. The whispers grew louder, overlapping one another. She could hear them now, clearly. "Lucy, ... please, ... And then, just like that, the shadows morphed, and in front of her stood a figure, one of the children. The face was blurry at first, like it was half-formed from the darkness itself. But as it solidified, she could make out the faintest features, pale skin, hollow eyes, and a twisted smile that made her stomach lurch. It wasn't a child anymore, not in the way she had expected. It was a thing, a ghost, a trapped soul that had lost its humanity. Double quotes, please. ... The figure whispered, its voice a strange mixture of desperation and malice. Help us. Lucy took a step back, her heart racing. What do you want from me? She gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure stepped closer, its hollow eyes fixed on her. You have to release us, it pleaded, its voice breaking. The house won't let us go. It won't let us rest. Lucy shook her head, her pulse racing. I don't know how. I don't know what to do. The figure reached out toward her, its hand cold and translucent. You are the key, it whispered. You are the one who can free us. Before Lucy could respond, the figure vanished, just as quickly as it had appeared. The house went silent again. But Lucy knew now. She knew what she had to do. She had to find a way to break the curse. She had to find a way to free the children who had been trapped here for so long. The house was alive with the memories of the lost, and it wouldn't stop until they were freed. Lucy ran down the stairs, desperate to find her parents, to tell them what she had seen. But as she approached the living room, she was stopped in her tracks. The air was thick with tension. John and Mary were standing by the fireplace, their faces pale. They had seen something, felt something too. What happened? Lucy asked, her voice trembling. Mary looked at her, her eyes wide with fear. We saw them, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The children, they were standing in the doorway. They're asking for help. Later that night, the house was quieter, but the unease had never been stronger. The family huddled together in the living room, uncertain of what to do next. The house felt like a trap, each room an enclosure of the past, of those lost children, and the curse that had kept them bound. The question lingered in the air. How could they free them? The truth was clear now. The children had not simply died. They were trapped, and it was the house itself that had ensnared them. The family could feel it. The house was watching them, feeding off their fear, feeding off the energy of their confusion and desperation. The house wanted them to stay. The house wanted their souls, and it would do anything to make sure they stayed trapped, just like the children before them. Now that Lucy knew the truth, that the house was not just haunted, but cursed, she couldn't turn back. She had to find a way to break the hold it had over the spirits. She wasn't sure how, but she knew one thing for certain. The children were not the only ones who were trapped in this place. The Thompsons were too. The Thompsons left the house that day, but when they looked back, it was no longer the same place. The haunted house had finally found peace. The dawn came slowly, but it didn't bring peace. The house remained as oppressive and suffocating as ever, but Lucy knew it wasn't just a house anymore. It was a prison for the souls that had been trapped there for decades. They had to leave. It was the only option. After hours of silence, the Thompsons finally made the decision. They couldn't stay. The children's cries were too much, the house too powerful. But before they left, Lucy had to return to the attic one final time. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she had missed, something that might help them break free from the house's hold. With Ben by her side, Lucy went up to the attic, feeling the cold embrace of the house around her. The attic was as it had always been, filled with forgotten memories and abandoned relics. But when Lucy turned to the corner where she had found the old trunk, something had changed. The trunk, which had been empty just hours before, was now open. Inside was a small box, a jewelry box with intricate carvings. Lucy opened it, and inside was a key. The key wasn't old, like the others. It was new, shining brightly in the dim light of the attic. Lucy reached for it, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. This was it, the key that would unlock the curse. She turned toward Ben. We need to leave now, she said, her voice urgent. They both ran downstairs, past the rooms they had come to know too well. As they reached the front door, Lucy stopped and turned back. Outside, the house looked different. It was as though the weight of the years had fallen away. The eerie presence that had loomed over it had dissipated, replaced by a strange stillness. The house, though dark and decaying, no longer seemed alive. It had let them go. Lucy glanced one last time at the house and knew that the children were finally free. They had paid the price. They had freed themselves from the curse of the house. The house remained standing, its windows dark and empty. It was no longer a prison for the lost souls, but a quiet, forgotten relic of the past. The Thompsons walked away, the sun rising behind them. They would never forget the house, or the children who had been trapped within it. But for now, the house was finally at peace, and so were the children.